The Culture High is another one where it seems as though a lot of, correct me if I'm wrong, your upbringing, being around the club that your father owned, Cheetahs, this was your second weed film. This was in, I believe, 2014. Um,
Correct. Yeah.
and it was
Yeah.
just very educational in many ways. I know there are tons of films now that go over marijuana usage, but this fell ahead of the curve a little bit. And one thing that a lot of Americans know about, and even if you don't, it's very good to know, that in 1971, Richard Nixon said public enemy number one is drug abuse, which was insane. A judge named Jim Gray, this was revealing, said the Nixon administration knew drug treatment worked and incarceration rates do not, but the enormous political benefit from declaring the war on drugs, people can't fight back. They chose the incarceration route for political reasons and then were absolutely overwhelmed at the positive political benefits they received for doing it. How did you uncover this and what did you learn as a filmmaker?
Well, this is between those two films, and it's funny because even all the films we've done now, my first one, The Union, The Business Behind Getting High, and The Culture High, I encourage anybody to Google those. If you Google top 10 cannabis films ever made, those are usually one and two or one and three. They're both in the top three. And I think why they turned out so good or connected in a way and saying ahead of the curve instead of saying good, I don't want to is that like I'm not a cannabis user. Sure, I've tried it and done like everybody else, but it's not my thing. But going into this, I just wanted to look at the BC industry and how this billion-dollar industry was functioning while remaining illegal and was so kind of like in the gray. You knew people were doing it. It was bizarre. So, and going into it, we went into it totally eyes wide open and discovered these things. Like, when we discovered that the Nixon report, they just totally ignored the Schaefer report and the Nixon. They're like, oh, we're just going to start a war on drugs anyway because it works politically. Like, you're like, what? No, 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 that can't be actually right. Did they actually do that? And then you actually like public information, it's there. You're like, what? And then you're like, and then when you find out like no one has died from directly using cannabis, and you're like, no, 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 but come on, that can't. And then you check the LD stats, and they're no one like, yes, of course, people smoke it and they're intoxicated, crash. Yes, and that is an ongoing thing, driving while intoxicated of any substance. But we just kept being like, this can't be right. This can't be right. And then you really learned like so many things. You pull back the veil and just how like political things are just used in anything. If it gets an emotional response to pin sides against each other, politicians be like, that's our Trojan horse to go in. It gets people riled up. It divides people. It allows us to get a strong vote. And that's where you really just saw. And then you saw the corruption of how they used it early on to target blacks and minority groups because it was an easy way to get them out of areas you wanted. They're like, oh, boom, they're smoking. Oh, I think I smell cannabis. Oh, boom, I found it. Simple possession. You now have a record. You're incarcerated. Cops, and we interviewed in there with all these undercover cops and officers talked about, they're like, yeah, one arrest is worth one arrest. So when we were given quotas to get arrests, it's really hard to get a murderer or a pedophile or a really sinister person because you got to get DNA, you got to get evidence, you got to get witness testimony, you got to have videotape, you got to have, but drugs is easy. We go up. I think I smell weed, even if they don't smell it. And then they find it. Oh, gotcha. Possession, you're over amount. Boom, gotcha. Now you're in the legal system, right? Now you've got a criminal record. And we have that great quote in the union. And then we have something similar in the culture. I was like, you can beat an addiction. You'll never beat a conviction. That haunts your
Mm.
record. Traveling the border, getting a job, becoming a member of society. It puts you into the prison system, which we go deep into with the culture eye and how that is modern day slavery, right? And how do you ensure that prisons stay full, even if crime goes down? Well, you get them for simple possession because that's an easy one.
It was rather shocking to hear all of this. And I know there was a really good documentary that came out a few years ago as well that touched on how one amendment in the United States Constitution actually is legalized slavery and has allowed the prison industrial complex to boom. But there were so many people that you interviewed that you touched on. You interviewed Cash Heed, a former head of VPD drug squad, Graham Hancock, a journalist, Ed Burns from the Baltimore Homicide and Narcotics. He was a detective. You interviewed Howard Marks, a drug smuggler. You interviewed Todd McCormick, who has a crazy history of his own after I learned about this. He had a rare form of cancer from childhood. He began using marijuana with his doctor's approval at the age of 9 to relieve his suffering, and he survived his fight with cancer, and he dedicated his life to showing how this medicine can be used. I want to go back to something real quick, which was Todd McCormick did say at one point, a researcher and activist, that the Nixon administration wrote to universities to pull information on marijuana out of libraries. Let's be very clear. If you are a politician who wants to ban literature, you want to ban research, you want to ban books, the history is not on your side. Why did so many of them, and I know it's pretty obvious, oh, they wanted to win elections, but why did so many of them do this?
Well, it seemed obviously win elections, but then all, another part is like I think, and we touch on it, we don't have all the fact, but it's also financial gain, right? Like there's private prisons, things that profited from this. So pulling the literature, I think, is one that they could just prevent themselves from getting caught down the road, right? I don't think they really predicted that the internet would eventually give people access to all this stuff and you couldn't do that anymore. So I think there's a way to control the people because if you found out the ending of our first film, the Union, we interviewed Lester Grinspoon, who only passed away a couple of years ago, who was the first Ivy League medical doctor to actually dive into the history of cannabis. And he has a crazy story of why he did it. His best friend going through college was Carl Sagan. And Carl Sagan used to smoke weed all the time and work at NASA and come up with these great critical theories of the universe and inspired people. And Lester, as a professor of emeritus and a medical doctor, is like, Carl, that stuff's going to kill you. You got to stop smoking that. Like, haven't you heard? And he's like, oh, Lester, it's not as bad as people say. And he's like, no, no, I'm going to show you. It is. It's worse. So then Lester started pulling all the medical studies and literature from all the different universities to as a thing to prove his his buddy wrong. He was like, oh my God, I couldn't believe that I had been duped. Here I am, a medical professor, a professor emeritus at Harvard. And when I actually looked at the literature, which most people don't actually read because it's very hard to understand and it's, medical jargon and confusing language, he was like, this isn't nearly as bad as the media is portrayed. Like, sure, there are harms and abuse of everything. I'm not trying to say it's a-okay to just do it all the time, but he was like, this is insane. So then he wrote his first book, Marijuana Reconsidered. And Harvard tried to pull his status and like they were like, you cannot do this. He took huge flack from that. And he was like, wow, why am I getting attacked? I am simply putting in a more way, like an easier way for people to digest the information. But I literally just read the medical studies that are out there, the very few, because it was still scheduled a Schedule One
Schedule
narcotic,
one,
which
yeah.
no medical value. So you had your studies were limited. Um, but then his book became a big hit. And then just as life would happen, he got struck with an unfortunate tragedy. His son was diagnosed with leukemia and was really not taking well to treatment and was deteriorating really quick. And actually was a colleague of Lester's. And he was like, Lester, man, I've read your book. I'm seeing what your son's going through. Don't you think you should try cannabis? And he was like, man, my son's only 12 and Lester, he was in tears last time we interviewed him because he said, I wish I would have stood up sooner, but because I was scared of Harvard and I didn't jump on it right away. But finally he did. He's like, hey, my son's just deteriorating so quickly. He's not eating, he's getting too nauseous. I've got to try something. And here's the irony of it all. He's a Harvard doctor's wife. They don't know where to get a joint or cannabis. So they actually went to the one place that the war on drugs said it would protect the most. They went to the local high school and said, hey, like, we don't know where to get this. Could you help us? And everybody was like, is this a sting or what do you? They're like, no. And they knew his son and they were like, and within 10 minutes, his son's friends went and got him a couple joints. They went into the school, came back, they're like, here you go. And that was the first day his son had eaten like a sandwich after the chemo treatment, and the anxiety and everything had been brought down. And that changed Lester. That's when Lester's like, okay, I'm not now just writing books about this. I'm going to be an activist and speak to this because I've seen it. And he got a couple more years with his son. His son unfortunately passed from leukemia still. He lost the battle, but he really believes that he's like, if I didn't have that, I would have lost him a year and a half sooner because he was deteriorating so quickly and he couldn't handle the anxiety and the eating issues and the nausea. And that's when he really got vocal. And then he became, witness in the John Lennon case and all these different things. He became, when you're interviewing all these intellectuals and you're going through this and then having to back it up on the research, I remember I looked at the world differently, and that was a constant compliment we got from both films. They're like, man, I didn't just learn about cannabis. I just learned about how society works and how governments manipulate us with like emotional triggers and push a path down because their political agenda, it helps them either financially or to win. It's really sinister. And you're like, if they can lie to you about cannabis, like what else? And now it just seems like with, like it's blown the lid off. Like now it's like, I don't believe anything any of them say now. Now I'm kind of like, even if it's just something like, it was a sunny day today when I was campaigning. I'm like, was it really sunny? I don't know. It was probably raining, right? And like, I just don't like now it's like everything they say is a lie. Everything is for political gain. Everything is to pull the sides apart and make you vote for one or the other. It's just those films really opened my eyes to just culture. And one of the biggest shocks for me was interviewing all the ex-law enforcement and how many of them feel horrendously guilty about how when they were making their quotas, how they were actually like Norm Stamper, the former police chief of Seattle. He was hired to go undercover in college campuses, infiltrate college students that were studying and smoking cannabis and raid them and pull them out of college and give them criminal records and arrest them. And he was like, how that was helping society was beyond me. Here's college students not hurting anyone, smoking a joint. Some of them, it really helped them with anxiety or whatever else rather than taking Adderall or something and allowed them to focus and study. And here I am yanking them out of a secondary education, giving them a criminal record, which haunts them forever. A lot of them have guilty conscience, and that's why they started the organization LEAP, which is Law Enforcement Against Prohibition,
Mm.
because they saw how we were doing far more harm, their words, than helping in communities. And one of the biggest things, I can't remember which officer said it, but this one struck me big time, is that their fathers that were beat cops, right? Before the drug war really amped up in the 70s. I believe that's when it's really, forget the years exactly, but a beat cop used to work the beat. You'd walk the neighborhood. You were friendly. They'd be like, "Hey, Adam, what's up?" You're like, "Hey, how's it going, Mrs. Smith? How's this going?" And they would tell you, like, "Hey, you might want to check the house up there. There's been all hours of the night, weird stuff going on. I don't like my kids going there. The people seem sketchy." You could get information because you worked with the community to prevent violent crimes, to prevent a potential kidnapper, rapist, violent crime, meth lab, like really dangerous. But once the drug war came in and the whole thing came on snitching on people to get your sentence lowered, the cops said we lost one of our most valuable assets to preventing crimes was information because nobody wanted to talk to us now because you're like, no, we'd go to the cop and he'd be like, hey, hey, come here. And then he'd pull you over, find a joint, give you a criminal record. You're in and out of the system. So people are like, fuck that. I ain't talking to the cops anymore. I ain't telling you shit. So they closed the door. So the old beat cops that used to like be valued, they used to work with the community and the community would tell them unwanteds. They lost that, right? And then that's when things had to amp up. And then you saw the real militarization of the police force with like the armored cars and then was it Norm Stamper who they were talking about how their budgets work, and that's so corrupt, where literally budgets of precincts wouldn't have enough money to fund everybody's payroll and stuff for the year. So when they'd have their meetings, they'd say, "Hey guys, like I don't remember the exact numbers, but say their budget for the year was 10 million bucks, right?" They're like, "We only have five given to us from the county and the state, and so we need to go out there and get seizures of assets." And the only way you get seizures of assets is for the drug war.
I
You
have
don't
that
get,
number. From
right?
1989 to 2010, an
Yeah.
estimated $12.6 billion was seized by U.S. attorneys in asset forfeiture cases. The growth rate of seizures that time was nearly a 20% increase every single year.
Exactly. Because their budgets, they weren't even funded enough. So then you start, and I remember hearing this, it was just like, oh my God. Like when the cops are like, so do you think we focused on pedophiles or rapists or those things? Hell no, because we don't get seizure, we don't get our budgets, we don't get our bonuses. Our sole focus came on to getting drug dealers and smugglers and things that we could get seizures of assets. And then I think it was Jack Cole, who was one of the original six hired in New Jersey back in the 70s. He was like, he's like, it got so bad that like rookie cops were driving brand new Cadillacs that they'd seized, that the federal government had to come in and be like,
Mm-hmm.
"Hey guys, you can't all be driving $100,000 cars and be having boats and like you can't seize." And then the corruption goes so deep where then you pull somebody over and they got $300,000 cash in the back. And the guy's like, maybe I was just speeding and there's no money in the back, right? And then the cop's like, yep, sounds good to me. And then if you're a rookie cop and you're a veteran, your police chief and your boss is like, okay, kiddo, here you go. I'm going to give you 50 grand. You shut the fuck up. We don't talk about this. Well, then now you're trapped in it too, right? So a lot of these cops that we interviewed, they're now retired and they're out, but they have guilty conscience. And that to me was some of the most moving stuff was interviewing these guys from law enforcement against prohibition and how that had shifted. It was like, oh, heavy stuff.
There's one thing you touched on about how there is a sort of framing around this stuff, and one quote that also stuck out to me was from Graham Hancock, excuse me, where he said, "Whenever we hear the war on anything, our antenna should go up." That was like, oh my God, yes, absolutely, it should, because as a media major, as someone who has worked in this industry, and also seeing how I'm being blunt here, the approach by many in media is turning into like exposed, revealed, and like I'm guilty of it too at times because we want to get attention, but this was attention in the worst way possible, where you are declaring war on a drug that is safe and effective, is medicinal, and from Nixon to Reagan to Nixon, if we're going in order, Reagan to Nixon, and then seeing many other politicians as well being carried out in this way to, as we stated, build up the prison industrial complex was disgusting. There was one other thing that you touched on. Excuse me. There was not a lot here, but I know you dug into this, so I am curious. Can you explain to me how HSBC laundered money to Mexican cartels?
So we don't have the exact details other than we know they had to pay a giant fine.
1.9 billion.
Yeah, 1.9 billion with a B, is that they were, because they were international banks, they were in places that didn't have as much like checks and balances to make sure that large amounts of cash that were unaccounted for were coming in. And this is something you're seeing, like, I mean, Billy Corbin talks about this in Cocaine Cowboys too, where like there was banks you've never heard of, like the International Bank of Miami, that these giant buildings, because they were just funneling the money through, right? Like it is, it is a crazy, it is like ultimate power ultimately corrupts, right? Corruption hits the highest levels when the amount of money started coming through, and it hit all levels where banks weren't, immune to it. Law enforcement wasn't, politicians weren't. It just was crazy to see and to learn that. It really, that's where I got hooked on docs. Once you learned on this, is like, oh my God, the world does not operate in the way that I was portraying, right? Like it is really, I had a very, growing up in vanilla Canada, and I was like, oh, things are like, I was like, I didn't know shit. And it's crazy that those two films still hold. I'll do something today and people will still say, they're like, man, that movie changed the way I looked at the world, right? Like you didn't just teach me about cannabis that day. You taught me about how the world functions and how it can operate on a lie and how those narratives can be pushed and how people will just regurgitate because they don't want to take the time to look, like they don't want, there's that great scene where we have it look like it's passing the buck down, and nobody wants to check and balance the person in front of them, because God forbid somebody do that when you get into power. So you just kind of pass the buck and you kind of follow that, right? So it is pretty crazy to think, like, I never thought when I was doing either of these films, I never thought cannabis would be legalized. And I can say a pretty interesting tidbit is that both the union and the Culture I were invited to Parliament Hill in Canada, which is like our Capitol Hill, by the Liberal Party, um, because it received thousands and thousands of emails and letters, even physical snail mail letters referencing our films, that they were like, hey, this could actually get us the younger voters. We should
Ah,
really take a look at this. Like, because I'm not giving them enough credit that they just did it for the goodness of their heart, right?
right.
They did it because they were struggling to get young voters, and they were seeing how much. So they actually had me and Brett do a screening at Parliament Hill. And when I first got the invite, I remember, and it was like Joyce Murray, Senator, Liberal Party, Parliament. Like I thought, it was like, is this a sting? Is this a prank? Like they're not
Totally.
inviting us to actually screen the movie there. And sure enough, we went there, and I remember Brett, our director, who you met, he was down filming at Young Turks. He was
Hmm.
like, "Hey," He's like, I'm going to operate the camera and get some B-roll. And you actually see footage of it in the Culture Eye. We show it like some of the steps in Parliament Hill and all that. And he goes, so like, look, if politicians, because we rip on politicians a lot in the film, right? And how they go wherever the wind blows and what they think they can get votes. And they were all laughing though. They thought it was hilarious because like it's bang on. But he was like, look, if it gets really bad, Adam, and they get mad and gets kind of heated, I'm going to say I'm just a camera guy. Okay. And then you can be the, I was like, oh, thanks for leaving me. So you want me to speak? He's like, yeah, just say I'm the camera guy, not the director, right? Let's just leave it. But then it was really interesting. Even the liberals were really shocked because conservatives and other parties and NDP, we really became a bipartisan screening. People all from all wanted to come check it out and see what was drawing so much attention. And it was really fascinating to be like, wow, our film actually like broke through and is making a change. And then 4 years after, 2 years after they screened, because they brought us up for the union and they brought us out again for the Culture Eye, then they passed a legalization bill. And that it was loosely drafted on what they'd learned because none of them had taken any time to learn other than the film. That's what sparked them. And again, that's because they saw how much attention it was getting and kept referencing it and it was like the pinnacle of social media at a time that social media was, I call it like the free organic kind there before algorithms and hoodwinks and all these ads.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so when they were getting thousands of messages, these are just people taking the time being like, hey, you need to take a look at this, right? People need it for medical purposes and pain rather than opiates and highly addicted drugs and like and all that other garbage. And we shouldn't be wasting our prisons and the incarcerations and everything. And they ended up doing it. And that's why originally I had voted for Trudeau and the Liberals. I was like, wow, they're actually going to go for a legalization bill. I never thought it would happen in my lifetime, but they did. And only a few years after that, it was interesting to see how we all grew up that cannabis was evil and dangerous and was going to be society's downfall. And then during COVID, it was an essential service that had to stay open with liquor stores.
That's
Like,
right.
like, wow, did that narrative shift from when we did cannabis docs where this was the end of the world and the pinnacle of all drug problems and it was going to ruin everything to be like, no, these things got to stay open. They're an essential service. They help people in anxiety and pain. I was like, wow, that is a shift that happened faster than I thought.
Definitely. I remember in LA, they stayed open. They were
Yep.
open all the time, and we went many times.